living in despair, feeling drained, biologically depleted, no joy. When you're in the freeze response, it is true that the panic is lessened. It does numb us a bit, but then it also takes away our ability to feel joy and happiness because it's also numb. Many of you are already familiar with this. When we look at the middle parasympathetic window, this is where we are calm, we are curious, we feel connected to ourselves, to other people. It's that, what people call feeling grounded, feeling very present, and important to this conversation that we're having today, feeling secure. And as it relates to the autoimmune stuff that we'll be talking about and the fatigue stuff, it's where we feel healthy. So in every sense of the word, this is where we want to have our nervous system for our best self, for our best health. Now, what happens when we have any type of stress or a threat? Not that this ever happens to any of you. I know, this is all theory that we're talking about now. But what if you had something stressful happen? What is the response that happens in the nervous system? It's this massive amount of energy. You can even think of it in terms of massive amount of adrenaline that is released in order to be able to respond to that. Now, when we talk about the stress response, you always hear it said, fight, flight, or what is it? The freeze, right? Fight, flight, or freeze. Mm-hmm. But where in this is the freeze response? Like, I have just responded very active in order to respond to a threat. So where in this is the freeze response? And the freeze response is actually part of that stress response, but it doesn't come until later. With the freeze response, there is a clear trigger for the freeze response. And that trigger is anything that is too much. So anything that is too much, and our system goes into freeze response. Any system, right? So this would be examples of something that feels too much, where you're there, you're functioning, you're still getting through, but something is too much. That something feels like the energy drained out of me. That is another great way to explain what the freeze response can feel like. It's not that you have a lot of energy like you had in that initial response to a threat. It's where the energy completely is drained. You can feel a knot in your stomach. You can feel like you just want to hide. You can feel like you've got to put on the fake smile because you just went into a very shame place and your mind probably isn't even there anymore. You're not hearing what other people are saying. You've disconnected in order to handle this flood of shame and emotions around your system. Let me share with you what happens exactly when our system goes into the freeze response, because it's not probably what you think. So what happens is that we have this dive, I call it the dive down into the freeze response. This is the polyvagal theory. Some of you might be familiar with that, right? Where you've gone from now sympathetic and a threat, or at least a possible threat, or something that your brain tells you might be a threat, and it becomes too much and you go down into the overwhelm. And there are characteristic thoughts, behaviors, and diseases that are a result of frequently going into the freeze response. Let's look at the root causes of a strong pull to the freeze response. Chronic stress and overwhelm. And that's how it will feel. And that's one of the root causes of the strong pull to the freeze response. And again, part of this talk that we'll look at is how far back did that chronic stress and overwhelm go? Because for many people, they have early attachment relationships that for that period of time in their life when they were an infant or a young child, it was stressful, it was overwhelming to their system, and it started this pattern of going to the freeze response in order to survive, cope, and get through. But certainly big traumatic events, big T events, can be a reason as well for a strong pull to the freeze afterwards. But then you look at all the biological things, right? You've got the biochemical imbalances. I talk a lot about those. You have mitochondrial inefficiencies, which just means that your cells, even especially your nerve cells, have a harder time making energy. And so if you have lower amounts of energy, your body is already going to be prioritizing how it uses that energy. And if a stress comes your way, your body is going to be like, I don't have enough energy for that. So I'm just going to go into this. I don't care. I don't care because I don't have the energy to care. And inflammation, of course, is going to be a reason for your body reaching that point of overwhelm faster. And then there's a long list of other biological factors as well. Let's talk about attachment. Why would attachment insecurities be related to the freeze response? So let me explain it and show you a picture here that will help explain that. So when an infant is born, they actually do not have a developed nervous system and a fully developed capacity to keep their own nervous system calm. They actually require someone else to do that for them. So what happens is that they will get really upset very quickly and need someone to what we call co-regulate in order to bring their nervous system back down into that parasympathetic where they're happy, they're, playing with their feet, they're sticking their toes in their mouth, they're doing the normal baby things that they do when they're feeling connected, when they're feeling loved, when they're feeling that all their needs are being taken care of. There's so many different things that would otherwise be considered normal, innocent, but that actually are very harmful to the nervous system. And so we have this pandemic of children growing up now with insecure attachments, though I would say that most of us also have some degree of insecure attachment. I think that 10 years ago, the rate was around 80% of the general public in the United States had an insecure attachment. That's gone up by now, but this is becoming our normal. So it's not like it's something bad, there's something wrong with you. This has kind of become our normal to have these attachment insecurities that really, when we look back at the baby, that would have been trauma to their nervous system because it leaves these lasting effects of unable to handle the stimulation. And what happens is that they get overwhelmed so quickly that they go right into the freeze response. This is how attachment is strongly, strongly connected to the freeze response. And most people who come through the programs, most people who do the 21-day journey, that was one of the big ahas for you going through that program and that course was, I had no idea that I had such a strong freeze response. I had no idea how often I was actually going into the freeze response. I thought that was just me. I thought that was just my personality. And it's not, right? Like it's actually not. And it's something that we can rewire and we can change. Now that we've talked about attachment, let's talk about the autoimmune and the fatigue as it relates to the freeze response. Because what happens is that the body has this response that is a normal, natural consequence, or I should say downstream effect of the freeze response. And so what that means is that when the nervous system has this imbalance in it, and one of the words that I hope that you'll start to just use more and think about is regulation. And regulation refers to being able to stay in this middle parasympathetic state where you are calm, you alive, you're curious, you're connected. That is regulated. You're grounded, you're healthy, you're feeling secure. And so anything outside of that is going to be dysregulated unless it's a normal threat response where you go into the sympathetic and then you are able to come back into the parasympathetic and not have it stay causing dysregulation in your nervous system, because that's where it will lead to the autoimmune and the chronic fatigue. And it's really interesting because these are only two of many conditions that are strongly associated with the adverse childhood experiences study. It's interesting to see that these types of conditions are associated with the early childhood stuff because of this strong freeze response that develops early in childhood and causes these chronic effects on the rest of the body, on the rest of the biology. So I call this the biology of trauma, and how you can actually see, based on the health conditions that you have, that, hey, whether I like it or not, whether I understand it or not, I have these patterns. And that's actually how I found my patterns. I had no idea that I had attachment insecurities. I had no idea that I had stored trauma. There was nothing unique about my story that I thought that I would have stored trauma. But when I got diagnosed with autoimmune condition, my autoimmune markers were very high without really a clear reason. I was diagnosed with chronic fatigue and was having a ton of digestive issues. I looked at that and be like, oh my goodness, like here I am with all of these conditions that are associated with this. Why is that? And that's really where I dove deeper into this work. So with the autoimmune, what happens is that the freeze response is all about shame and feeling like I don't belong, there's something wrong with me, I'm not good enough. And so it's very much focused on kind of like inward and attacking oneself. And that's exactly what the autoimmune conditions are. They are your body making antibodies against your own tissues, as opposed to making antibodies against a foreign threat, like a bacteria, like a virus. One of the things that I'd love for you to be able to think about is, how do we get your cells, your nervous system, back to a place of trust and security? We have to work directly with our nervous system. So we work with the survival responses, the brain and body. We build that window of tolerance and your ability to have more capacity to hold stress, supporting the body to process the unresolved traumas that have been stored there, many of which, again, you're probably unaware, but at least after today's experience, and certainly probably after other experiences, you know that there's stuff there. There is stuff there. One of the key principles as it relates to the nervous system and rewiring the nervous system is that it really requires this consistent, gentle pressure. By applying this consistent, gentle pressure, what happens is that if it's inconsistent, right, and you do it one day and then you go maybe see a therapist and you do it a week later and then a week later, you'll get some shifts in your nervous system, but nothing like what you're able to do if you do a little bit every single day and start to rewire your nervous system and kind of redirect it to be like, oh, we've got other choices now. We don't have to go down that path of freeze response anymore. And actually, I don't even have to respond to that as a threat right now. I have tools that are very short, very effective in order to redirect my nervous system where I want it to go and be able to stay in my window of tolerance as I build that window of tolerance, build my capacity to handle stress and not lose it and not shut down and go into overwhelm either.